On the 53rd hour without sleep, the world narrows to blood, smoke, and the sound of men dying faster than you can remember their names. I learned that the body doesn't truly break when exhausted. It simply forgets how to care. The lasfire never stops. The air stinks of burnt flesh and cheap promethium, and every scream sounds like someone I once swore I'd save. They tell us medics are the soul of the regiment, but souls don't survive trench mud infused with rad dust and the chittering shadows of things that do not bleed. My job isn't healing. It's delaying the inevitable long enough for command to mark our corpses accurately on the next tactical data slate. Out here, mercy is a faster death, because no matter how hard I work, the Emperor does not grant miracles. He grants bodies to bury. If you can still hear my voice through the shell fire, stay with me. Subscribe, share the signal, and help others remember what we endure at the edge of the Imperium. They say every war begins with a single shot, but for me it began with the smell, thick, metallic, clinging to the back of my throat like rust and regret. It was the scent of blood on hot metal decking, pooled beneath bodies that still twitched from impact shock. I had been assigned to the 117th Vardask Line Infantry less than a day, barely through my first rites of induction, and the transport ramp hadn't even finished lowering before wounded men were dragged aboard, screaming for help in voices cracking with fear and disbelief. My hands shook so violently that my Medicae tools rattled against the inside of my kit, and the veteran beside me, a scarred sergeant whose name I never learned, leaned close enough for me to smell promethium on his breath. "You'll want to stop shaking before they hit the ground," he muttered, as if giving advice on tightening boots rather than stepping into hell. The wounded smell fear almost as strongly as corpses. I tried to swallow my panic, but it stuck, like a shard of glass. Outside, artillery thundered in uneven bursts, each impact sending vibrations through the dropship hull. Vardask Prime had once been a manufactorum world, a lattice of chimneys and steel roads feeding war machines to the Imperium. Now the chimneys sat silent, broken by bombardments and corruption, while twisted silhouettes moved between them under crimson skies. The planet was being eaten from the inside, not by alien claws or greenskin hordes, but by its own workers turned heretics, their bodies warped by whispers crawling through the warp. Cultists had seized the forges, daemons had seeped through cracks in reality, and the Astra Militarum had been called not to conquer, but to cauterize. The ramp slammed to the ground, heat washed over us. I ran, following the procession of soldiers into trenches carved between collapsed manufactorum conduits. Mud mixed with industrial sludge clung to our boots, and the color of it made my stomach twist. It was the same shade as dried blood. A man staggered toward me, both hands clutched to his chest. His flak armor was blackened, and beneath it his ribs were visible, peeled open like butchered meat. Plasma burns do not bleed, yet every breath he took forced steam from his lungs. He wheezed, "Help, please." I froze. Everything I had learned in training evaporated under the reality of torn flesh. I reached for my kit, but someone shoved me aside, a hardened field medic missing half his ear, moving with mechanical precision. He pressed sealant foam into the cavity, snapped a rib plate into place, and injected stimulants directly into the patient's heart. The man gasped once, eyes rolling, then went still. The medic closed his eyelids without ceremony. "That was the easy one," he said to me, not unkindly, but with the detached exhaustion of someone who has long accepted that survival is rationed, not guaranteed. The screams rose louder from the next trench. I forced myself forward. My first patient alone was a boy younger than me, maybe 16 standard years, his throat torn open by shrapnel. He was trying to speak, but only bubbles of blood escaped. His eyes widened when I knelt. He grabbed my forearm with such strength that his nails pierced my skin through the fabric. I sealed the wound, applied pressure, prayed silently to the Emperor that the artery hadn't fully ruptured. My breath came in ragged bursts as I worked. When the bleeding slowed, I injected a coagulant and whispered to him that he would live. He stared at me as if I had lied. When his grip finally loosened, I realized his pulse had already faded. I sat back in the mud, soaked in blood that was not mine, and for a moment I could not hear the battle over the sound of my own heartbeat. A shell landed close enough to throw dirt across my face. Men screamed, One lost his leg below the knee, bone jutting from the stump like a snapped blade. He howled for someone named Mara, calling her as if she stood beside him. I wrapped a tourniquet with trembling hands, cinching it until the bleeding slowed. The soldier sobbed, leaning his forehead against mine as if I were the only solid thing in the world. He whispered, "Don't let me die here." I promised I wouldn't, even though I knew I might have just kept him alive long enough to die somewhere worse. Time blurred into a haze of bandages and severed limbs. Lasfire sliced through smoke like red lightning. Flyers shrieked overhead, engines screaming as anti-aircraft fire tore them apart. I could taste the vaporized metal on my tongue. The trenches filled faster than we could empty them. Men stumbled back with eyes burned white from witnessing warp-spawned horrors. Others returned without faces, melted by acid spit from creatures that did not belong to mortal flesh. I treated wounds until my fingers went numb, until skin peeled from my gloves and my muscles ached with a pain that went deeper than fatigue. Some soldiers begged to be saved. Others begged to be killed. I learned quickly that mercy sometimes meant pulling the trigger. My first euthanasia came at dusk. A trooper lay curled in a crater, half his body fused to the ground by a daemon's touch. His flesh crackled like cooling slag, nerves still alive enough to feel every second of agony. He looked up at me with eyes that no longer reflected a human soul. "End it," he rasped. My hand shook as I lifted my sidearm. His lips formed a prayer. I fired. The silence that followed was not relief. It was guilt settling into marrow. Command Vox orders crackled through the trenches, distorted by interference. We were to hold position until reinforcements arrived, but the reinforcements never did. We were expendable, sacrificial. The cultists swarmed the outer barricades, their bodies warped by ritual mutilation. Some wore their flayed skin like banners. Others chanted hymns to things I refused to understand. The front line collapsed under pressure. Bodies, trampling bodies as soldiers tried to retreat without orders. I found myself pinned against a ruined barricade, treating a gunner whose jaw had been shattered. He could not speak, only sob through broken teeth while I stitched flesh as gently as shaking hands could. I whispered apologies for every needle pass, as though words could soften pain. Night fell like a closing fist. The air grew colder, and the sky flickered with warp tears that bled colors no sane mind should name. The wounded piled up faster than I could triage them. My kit ran empty. I ripped bandages from corpses to reuse them. I melted scrap metal for makeshift splints. I used promethium flame to cauterize wounds, forcing myself not to flinch when flesh curled and popped. Once, when I ran out of morphia, I held a soldier's hand and let him scream until his throat tore. He died anyway, but he died with someone beside him. In war, that can be the difference between a person and a statistic. As the hours passed, the front shifted again. The enemy breached the trenches, and hand-to-hand combat erupted. Bayonets clashed, chainswords chewed bone. Firelight revealed silhouettes of men stabbing one another with rusted tools. I dragged bodies into cover, treating whoever I could reach. It stopped mattering whose uniform they wore. Pain does not recognize allegiance. I held a cultist's skull as he died, his eyes reverting to something almost human beneath the madness. He whispered a name, perhaps his own, before his pulse vanished. The roar of battle faded sometime after the 30-hour mark. Dawn crawled over the horizon like a reluctant apology. Smoke drifted in ghostly layers. Bodies lay half-buried in sludge. The wounded moaned in a chorus too weak to rise above the silence. I stood in the cratered mud, my uniform stiff with dried blood, my gloves shredded, my mind fractured into shards that no amount of rest would realign. Around me, a few survivors staggered, too numb to cry, too exhausted to speak. A Commissar walked among the living, reciting litanies of duty, his voice hollow. He never looked at the bodies. To him, they were already accounted for. I did not sleep. I walked among the fallen, marking the dead with strips torn from my own jacket so recovery crews could identify them. Each tag felt like a confession. Every name etched into my memory weighed as heavily as the dead I could not carry. I realized then that the battlefield had no end. War did not pause. It simply waited for us to catch our breath before demanding more. When the sun rose fully, Command declared our deployment a tactical success. We had held the line long enough for orbital bombardment to cleanse the enemy positions. The flames that fell from the sky turned Manufactorum towers into molten skeletons. The screams that rose beneath them echoed across the plains long after the fire died. I sat against a shattered wall, staring at my hands, wondering whether they had saved anyone at all. A passing officer told me I'd done well, that the Emperor watched over men like me. I smiled because answers require energy, and I had none left. When he left, I whispered to myself the truth that no scripture would dare speak. The Emperor does not watch us, he endures us, and I endure him. That was the first day. The wound never closed. Night on Vardusk Prime was never truly night. The Manufactorum ruins bled a constant dull glow from molten metal pools and lingering promethium fires that crawled beneath, collapsed chimneys like embers trapped in a dead god's lungs. The sky above flickered with residual warp lightning, silent arcs of malevolent color that flashed without thunder, as though reality itself strained against invisible seams. We found shelter in what had once been an assembly yard for bulk transport housings, its skeletal girders rising into the darkness like the ribs of some extinct industrial colossus. The ground was littered with shattered cogplates and fragments of torn augmetics, too warped to recognize whether they belonged to workers, soldiers, or something summoned by corrupted forges. The wind howled through twisted metal, creating a low keening sound that made the hairs at the back of my neck rise. We spent the first hours gathering those who had survived the day's assault. Some crawled to us, through the mud, dragging themselves by elbows because their legs no longer obeyed commands. Others lay in shallow craters, staring blankly into the smoky sky, alive only because death had not yet bothered to claim them. I moved from body to body beneath the skeletal shadow of the ruins, my lamp fueled by sputtering charge cells, the light flickering over faces that blurred together into one endless expression of pleading exhaustion. Darren assisted me without complaint, his hands stained to the elbow, his thoughts locked behind a silence that felt more like surrender than resilience. Seren walked perimeter watch, hunched beneath the weight of failure. The fighting had ended hours ago, yet the air still carried echoes of screams, as if memory was trapped in the smoke. I began with triage. It was not medical, it was mathematical. Which ones could be saved with what we had left? Who had hours, which had minutes, and which were already dead but too stubborn to realize it? A lieutenant, with a cauterized stump where his arm had once been, begged me to retrieve the limb so tech priests could reattach it. I told him the truth, gently. It had been vaporized. He stared past me, eyes dull, as if imagining life without that part of himself was harder than dying. A gunner whose lungs had been punctured whispered for his mother, until blood drowned his voice. I held his hand until the light faded from his eyes. Some wounds could be closed, others only needed witness. Then came the screams, not from the wounded near us, but from further in the ruins where shadows shifted. We grabbed our rifles and advanced cautiously, stepping over broken servo skulls that blinked erratically. A group of soldiers had cornered a cultist. He knelt against a collapsed bulkhead, chest stitched with ritual scars forming symbols that throbbed faintly in the dark. His mouth twitched with ecstatic frenzy as he chanted words that made the air ripple. The soldiers wanted him silenced. I wanted him alive, so command could interrogate him. Before I could argue, one trooper drove a bayonet between his ribs. The cultist cried out in a voice that sounded like it belonged to dozens of throats layered over one another. The earth shook. Something answered from beyond sight. We retreated to camp without speaking. Murder rarely felt like victory. Supplies grew scarce. I had counted only 3 vials of coagulant, 2 stim injectors, and a handful of sterigauze patches crusted with dried blood. I boiled water in a dented field pot over a makeshift promethium fire, letting it simmer with powdered antiseptic scrapings. The steam smelled like rust and burned hair. Soldiers queued before me, each carrying wounds wrapped in ragged cloth or left open to sour in the night air. I worked until my fingers went numb again, until my mind drifted on the edge of unconsciousness. Each bandage felt like a prayer offered to a god who did not answer. The worst came near dawn. A group of men from the 6th Auxiliary were brought in, carried on stretchers made from lasgun stocks and splintered plating. They had been ambushed in an alleyway where the manufactorum walls still whispered from residual warp energy. The survivors had been slashed with curved blades that left wounds too clean to be human. The cultists who attacked them were nowhere to be found. Their bodies had dissolved into piles of charred ash. I knelt beside the first soldier. His abdomen was cleaved open from hip to rib, yet no organs spilled outward. The flesh around the wound had hardened into crystalline rot. Each breath rattled like shattered glass. He met my gaze, and I saw nothing human in his eyes, only acceptance. "Don't try," he said with a faint smile. "It's already inside." My hands hesitated. I scanned his vitals. Infection spread faster than natural pathogens could. It was warp-borne, an invasive thing that slithered through cells and consumed identity. If I closed the flesh, it would trap the corruption. If I left it open, he would bleed out. He squeezed my hand weakly. "Save the others. I'm already lost." I looked into the faces around me. One could live if treated. One might live. The third would die either way. My chest tightened as the brutal arithmetic returned. Colder this time, less like logic and more like judgment. I injected the dying man with a sedative and stayed with him until his eyes dimmed. The next soldier clung to life with stubborn fury. His femoral artery had been sliced, blood pulsing with each heartbeat. Darren applied pressure as I threaded needle through flesh, tying sutures with movements so fast I barely felt them. The soldier cursed through gritted teeth, calling me every name under the sun, but his voice softened as the bleeding stopped. When I checked his pulse, it steadied. His eyes glistened. "Thank you, medic." He was alive only because someone else had not been. By the time we finished, the fires in the distance had faded. The sky bled purple, and it orange. Morning filtered through smoke. I sat beside a broken pillar, head in my hands, trying to breathe without tasting death in the back of my throat. War did not test the strength of arms. It tested the limits of empathy. No one told me that saving someone required killing a different version of myself each time. As full morning rose, Vox traffic crackled. A sergeant approached with grim orders. Chaos remnants regrouped in the upper hab blocks. We were to accompany an assault squad to recover an officer pinned under rubble. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to collapse into the mud and sleep until my bones dissolved. But a medic does not get to choose battles. We marched. The path took us through a labyrinth of shattered hab units carved from ferrocrete and rusted metal plates stamped with the Imperial Aquila. Families had once lived here. Now the walls were coated in ash and scripture written in smeared blood. Doors hung from hinges like broken jaws. A child's toy lay crushed beneath. A boot print so deep it could only have been made by a creature far heavier than a man. Every inhalation burned my lungs. The wind carried faint whispers, names repeated over and over in voices that did not belong to the living. We found the officer beneath a collapsed beam. His armor was intact, but his legs were pinned. The metal glowed with residual heat, too heavy to move by hand. He coughed blood as he saw us. I told command to pull back. They left me. He smiled bitterly. Of course they did. I knelt, scanning his vitals. Both legs shattered, internal bleeding, a wound near the liver seeping into the abdomen. If we moved him, he would die. If we stayed, we would die with him. He understood the balance before I did. "Medic." His voice softened. "You know what has to happen." My throat closed. "I can keep you alive long enough to evac." "We can," he interrupted. "There is no evac." The squad stood behind me in silence. They were waiting for me to decide, because they could not bear to speak the order. I withdrew a vial of morphia, the last one. His hand closed around mine, surprisingly strong. "Don't waste that. Give me a last charge. I want the Emperor to hear my death, not my whimpers." I didn't want to comply, but he was right. I placed a charged laspack in his palm, fingers curling around it like a sacrament. I stayed long enough to meet his eyes. He nodded once. As we withdrew, a single discharge echoed through the ruins. The squad marched on without speaking. We finally reached a barricade overlooking a plaza that had once been a workers' assembly point. Now it swarmed with cultists marching in rhythmic procession, chanting hymns that echoed off the walls like the tolling of rusted bells. Some carried banners stitched from skin, others wore masks carved from melted augmetics. Their voices twisted the air, warping perspective. If I listened too long, I felt my thoughts begin to bend. A single round snapped past my ear. Darren pulled me down behind cover. The firefight erupted instantly. I treated wounded where they fell, ducking behind columns as lasfire sizzled overhead. A trooper collapsed beside me, clutching his stomach. His armor had deflected the shot, but the force fractured ribs into bone splinters that pierced his lungs. He gagged on blood, choking, eyes bulging in panic. I worked quickly, inserting a drainage tube, sealing external wounds. His breath steadied. As he lay trembling, he whispered, "Why help me? Others need it more." I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Hours later, sunlight dipped behind steel monoliths, and we withdrew to camp, stepping over more bodies than footprints. I sat alone at the edge of the ruins, staring at my blood-stained hands in fading light. The voices of the dying lingered, threaded through memory like barbed wire. Saving one life had cost countless others I never even met. I realized survival was no longer the victory condition. Living with choices was. The wind carried the stench of burning flesh. Somewhere in the distance, another battle began. I tightened my gloves, reopened my medkit, and walked back toward the screams. By the third week on Vardask Prime, time no longer moved in hours or days. It moved in detonations, in pulses of lasfire, in the number of bodies I wrapped before the sun fell or rose. Sleep became a rumor. Rest became something I administered to others, but never tasted myself. My uniform had stiffened into a second skin of dried blood and ash. The wind carried the bitter tang of ozone and rust, blowing through the skeletal manufactorum towers like a choir of hollow throats whispering old hymns. The war had settled into a rhythm, a heartbeat made of artillery and distant screams, and the world itself seemed to breathe in cadence with death. Our regiment had dwindled to half its initial strength, those lost not only to enemy blades and warp sickness, but to desertion, execution, madness, or simple disappearance. One night I counted the stretchers and realized I remembered more corpses by name than the living. Command issued new directives daily, each contradicting the last as Vox channels warped beneath psychic interference. Officers died faster than they could be replaced. Eventually, leadership blurred into whomever was loud enough to shout orders and convincing enough to pretend they mattered. We were repositioned to the lower trench network beneath the collapsed hab spines on the outskirts of Forge Spire Ageron. The tunnels there were centuries old, narrow passages that once ferried workers and servitors between sectors of the industrial complex. Now they contained nothing except rot and echoes. When we arrived, the stench hit us first. Bodies sealed behind improvised barricades, sealed there long enough that they were no longer entirely corpses. Warp taint clung to them like a fungus. I tried to perform rites, but some things refuse benediction. The tunnels shook as artillery struck overhead. Dust cascaded like grey snow. The ceiling groaned. A sergeant barked orders to dig out a collapsed section where scouts reported trapped survivors. It was my duty to follow. Darren carried the cutting torch while I shouldered my medkit. Seren monitored atmospheric readings, his mechanical eye flickering with calculations. We descended deeper into the dark, guided only by flickering lumen strips and a map drawn from memory. The first survivor we found was pinned beneath a collapsed conveyor track, her leg crushed under ferrosteel plating. The bones had been pulverized into paste. She screamed when we tried to lift it, so I sedated her with a dose of synth morphia diluted to stretch our supplies. Her breathing slowed, her grip loosened, and with whispered apologies I amputated the limb. The sound of the bone saw echoed through the tunnel like the shriek of a dying machine. Blood drenched the stones at my feet. She survived, though I wondered whether I had spared her a life worth living. Others were not so fortunate. We dug through rubble until our knuckles bled, only to uncover bodies already stiff, crushed beyond recognition. One man sat, upright against the wall, head tilted as though listening. When I touched him, his flesh collapsed into dust, leaving behind only empty armor and a whispering echo that made my spine lock. Seren urged us to move quickly, his Binharic transmissions silent but emphatic. We obeyed, though none of us truly knew what chased us: collapse, cultists, or memories. Hours passed. The tunnels grew narrower, walls coated in soot and dried blood. The air tasted metallic, thick enough to chew. We found a group huddled in a chamber lit by a single flickering servitor skull. They had barricaded themselves behind crates and broken mech arms, clutching rifles with trembling fingers. When we approached, they pointed their weapons at us, too numb to differentiate friend from monster. Only when Serin flashed regiment identifiers across his augmetic lens did they lower their guns. Their leader, a corporal barely older than me, explained that their commissar had ordered a retreat to reinforce the upper lines, but the tunnel collapsed before they could ascend. They had rationed water and recycled air, waiting for rescue that never came. One man had died 2 days prior from infection. They had not dared burn the body. The smoke might suffocate them. They cried when we told them the way out was open again. We guided them through the tunnels, moving carefully to avoid vibration-triggered collapses. The group shuffled forward in exhausted silence, each step louder than the war above. Halfway to the surface, the ground convulsed. Dust swirled. A blast wave roared down the tunnel and extinguished every lumen at once. The world became black. Darren's voice cut through the dark, strained. "Rebreathers on. There's gas in the air." I heard shuffling, panicked breathing, the clink of mask seals locking. The darkness felt alive, pressing against skin. I fumbled for my lamp and triggered its charge coil. The beam flickered to life, illuminating the ruin ahead. The tunnel had collapsed, again, sealing the passage. Screams echoed from the other side, our rescued soldiers, now cut off. We dug with bare hands. The stone refused to move. The more we clawed, the more earth fell, burying hope beneath tons of ferrocrete. My nails split, my knuckles tore open. I kept digging anyway, even when I knew no one behind the blockage could still breathe. Darren pulled me back. I struggled, then sagged, breath shaking. The darkness swallowed the screams as they faded into silence, and I felt something inside me tear in a way no medkit could repair. We returned to the surface at dawn. The world above had shifted again. Chaos banners hung from broken smokestacks. Flayed skin fluttered like pennants. The Manufactorum plains smoldered in ash. The sky pulsed with unnatural color. Our regiment had fallen back to the final defensive perimeter near the ruins of a loading yard. Few remained. Their eyes were hollow. Their armor hung from gaunt bodies. Command Vox orders crackled. We were to retreat further west, abandoning remaining wounded. They were spent assets. My throat burned. I refused. I marched back into the ruins, alone at first, until Darren grabbed his rifle and followed. Serin stayed behind only long enough to reroute power to failing Vox relays, then joined us without explanation. We moved through shattered corridors where the wounded called out weakly, voices echoing between metal slabs. One man lay pinned beneath a loader's chassis, crushed from hips to ribs. He tried to salute when he saw me, but his arm trembled and fell. I injected painkillers, though I knew he would never walk again. Another clutched her stomach, intestines spilling through her fingers like rope. I pressed them back in place, sealing the wound with a coagulant foam I had been saving for someone who might live longer. We gathered as many as could still move, half carrying them through debris. Every step felt like walking through treacle, each gasp a reminder that we were fighting the Emperor's war with flesh, while the enemy fought with belief. Lasfire cracked above us, echoing through shattered rafters. Cultist silhouettes scrambled across catwalks, their eyes glowing with fanatic hunger. One dropped from above, blade raised. Darren shot him midair. The body hit the floor twitching, mouth still chanting even in death. We reached the extraction route as artillery thundered. Shells detonated against distant towers, shaking the ground so violently my teeth rattled. The wounded stumbled forward, leaning on one another, dragging themselves with broken limbs. Behind us, a Vox broadcast boomed. Forced withdrawal. Any remaining personnel were to be considered losses. A Commissar stood at the retreat checkpoint, black coat torn, hat missing, face streaked with soot. His bolt pistol gleamed. He saw the wounded trailing behind us and ordered them left. The Emperor needs soldiers, not burdens. My vision tunneled. I stepped between him and the wounded. His pistol rose. For a moment, time froze. The Emperor's sigil on his chestplate caught the dawn light like a flame. The Commissar's eyes held certainty, the kind forged in indoctrination, not cruelty. Darren tensed beside me. Seren's mechadendrites coiled, charged with static. "Step aside, medic," the Commissar said. I did not. For the first time since deployment, I felt something like faith, not in doctrine, but in the lives I carried. The Commissar assessed me, saw something in my eyes that shifted his calculus, and lowered the pistol. He turned away, barking new orders to other troops. We moved past him, dragging the wounded into trenches that led toward surviving staging grounds. I never learned whether my act saved lives or delayed deaths. I only knew I could not have chosen differently. That night, I sat alone beneath the ruins of a collapsed transport cradle. The sky above was sickly red. The horizon flickered with distant fire. My hands stank of dried blood. The screams of those buried in tunnels echoed behind my eyelids. I stared into the smoky wind and realized I no longer trusted command, scripture, or even the idea of victory. But when dawn came, I rose. I packed my kit. I walked to the wounded. Duty remained. Faith did not. Some things outlive belief. By the time the 4th week bled into the 5th, I could no longer recall how many soldiers I'd saved, and worse, how many I'd watched die with my hands on their wounds. Memory blurred into a smear of blood, smoke, and whispered last words that clung to my thoughts like ghosts refusing burial. The battlefield had shifted again, crawling westward along the shattered transportation lanes where rusted loading cranes leaned like toppled giants. Here, the Manufactorum wastelands gave way to plains of trampled ash, punctured by shell craters and charred remains of defensive bastions. No one knew if we still held ground, or if the front had swallowed us whole. The war didn't move like a line. It pulsed like a wound that refused to heal. The nights changed first. The enemy began attacking not to kill, but to maim, and leave bodies where we could see them. Cultists dragged half-living soldiers across no man's land, laying them out like offerings beneath flickering lumen strips rigged from scrap metal and bone. When dawn came, they were still breathing, barely. The implication was clear: they wanted us to come for them. They wanted to draw us into the open, not with strategy, but cruelty. And every time I looked into the eyes of a man left screaming in the mud, I knew I would go. My duty was not optional. It lived deeper than armor or oath. On the 41st night, a vox boom shook us awake before dawn. Darren shook my shoulder, voice raw. Front lines overrun. They're dragging survivors back toward the forges. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, where plumes of black smoke twisted into the sky. Flames painted the ruins in shades of hellfire, silhouettes writhing beneath them like phantoms. The regiment's command post had fractured. Platoons wandered without direction, some firing blindly into the dark, others running toward the screams as if trying to drown them. Seren returned from scouting with static crackling across his augmetic eye. He typed a short, "Here." He began to convulse, muscles spasming as though invisible wires pulled at his spine. I held him until his grip slackened. His chest stopped rising. His eyes remained open, staring at a sky he could no longer see. When I tried to close them, the lids resisted, stiffening like cooling metal. I swore under my breath, wiped blood from his face, and moved on. Further bodies lay in clusters, stacked as if arranged by ritual hands. I checked pulses, injected stims where possible. Some gasped awake long enough to scream. Others stared blankly, souls already gone. I whispered to each, even when I knew they could not hear. Not prayers, just presence. Then the corpse wall shifted. At first I thought it was wind, until the movement spread through limbs and torsos like a ripple. I stood, hand going to my rifle. Bodies began to twitch, not in rebirth, but as echoes, nerves firing from residual psychic contamination. The corpses convulsed, as if reacting to some external force that tugged at their remains like puppets. Darren cursed, stepping back with weapon raised. Seren scanned the area, glyphs racing across his lens. The dead did not rise. They trembled, spasmed, and fell still again. It was not possession, it was interference, the warp tugging at those whose minds had fractured before death. We moved quickly. The living we found further in the ravine were not soldiers. They were servitors, half-machines left trapped beneath collapsed cranes, their biological components torn and exposed as they tried to fulfill abandoned orders. One dragged itself forward using a single functioning arm, repeating "cargo manifest incomplete" as I sutured wires and nerves back into something resembling coherence. Another blinked at me through cracked ocular lenses and asked if the shipment schedule had changed. They were dying, but they didn't understand death. Something about that felt worse. Hours passed in a haze of stitching, splinting, and triage. My back ached, my fingers cramped. Blood seeped beneath my nails where gloves had torn. I worked because there was no alternative. When I finally stopped to drink recycled water from a dented canteen, dawn had arrived, stained red by smoke. That was when I noticed the silence. It was not peace, it was expectation. The cultists returned before the sun fully crested the horizon. They marched in lines of tattered robes, their bodies writhing with sigils carved into skin. Some had metal grafted directly into muscle, steam rising from joints like overworked engines. Others walked with limbs that bent in ways no mortal anatomy allowed. They did not scream or charge. They simply walked toward us, chanting a mantra that echoed through the ravine. Blood remembers, flesh returns. Their eyes locked onto me, not the soldiers, not the guns me. A medic was more threatening to their cause than a firing line. Darren fired first. Last rounds punched through skulls, splitting bone with precise red flashes. Several cultists fell. The others accelerated, moving unnaturally fast, closing the distance with blades raised. I ducked behind collapsed rails as the first wave hit. Blood sprayed across my coat, his, not mine. The soldier beside me fell, throat carved open. I wrapped a bandage around his wound, fingers slipping in slick warmth, even as Darren fought hand to hand beside me. One cultist lunged toward my back, blade glistening. Seren intercepted, slamming an augmetic arm into the attacker's jaw with enough force to crack bone. Sparks flew from his implants where corrupted steel met holy circuitry. He finished the strike with a burst of electromotive charge that left the cultist twitching, smoke rising from the corpse. More came. Too many. They didn't fight to kill, they fought to take, to create more bodies for their grotesque rituals. We fell back toward a rusted reinforcement arch. Darren dragged 2 wounded soldiers while I carried another across my shoulders. The weight nearly toppled me. My knees shook. My vision blurred. The smell of blood clung to my face like a mask. When we reached the arch, mortars fired from somewhere above, detonating in waves that sent debris raining like shrapnel hail. The cultists scattered, some burning, others hurling themselves into fire as offerings. The surviving soldiers of our regiment held the line from above, guns braced atop the ravine wall. For once, we were not alone. The assault broke, not ended, paused. Hours later, when the smoke cleared, I returned to the dead. The sky overhead dimmed beneath a veil of ash. My knees pressed into mud warmed by corpses. I began wrapping limbs, closing eyes, marking bodies for identification. I worked not because orders demanded it, but because silence demanded witness. Each corpse became a weight in my chest. I closed their eyes even when rigor fought me. I whispered their names when I knew them. When I didn't, I whispered mine. Then something changed. As I pressed a strip of cloth across the riva, chest of a fallen corporal, his hand twitched, not with lingering nerves, but with intention. His eyes opened. They were clouded over, pupils dilated into glassy voids. He exhaled without breath, lips forming a soundless plea. I froze. Seren stood behind me, mechadendrites raised, ready to strike. I shook my head. The body wasn't alive. Whatever animated it was memory, not soul. I placed my palm against his forehead. His muscles relaxed. His eyes closed again. The body fell still. The dead weren't rising. They were trying not to be forgotten. Night fell. Fires crackled beneath the broken spires. Men slept where they collapsed. Rifles held like talismans. I sat alone beside a pile of wrapped corpses, wiping blood from my hands until skin peeled raw. The moon reflected faintly from metal scraps embedded in the mud. For a moment I imagined I saw faces in the sheen soldiers I had failed, watching silently, not accusing, remembering. A wind blew through the ruins, carrying ash and faint whispers. I looked over the field of bodies and realized I had stopped treating wounds and begun treating absence. I no longer healed flesh. I preserved memory. When morning came, I rose again. There were more dead waiting. By the time the last offensive began, the regiment was a ghost of itself, wearing stolen armor and borrowed hope. Dawn rose like a dull blade across the horizon, smearing pale light across trenches soaked through with rain and blood. The Manufactorum ruins behind us no longer resembled buildings. They were jagged silhouettes jutting into the sky like broken teeth. Smoke coiled upward in streams, carrying flecks of ash that drifted across the battlefield like funeral snow. We no longer marched in formation. We drifted forward in fragments, skeletal ranks held together by necessity rather than command. Whatever officers remained no longer barked orders. They whispered them, afraid to expend the last shreds of authority on men who would soon be dead. The final push came not as a strategic directive or calculated assault, but as a resignation. We had been surrounded for 3 nights, cut off from supply lines, Vox interference too thick to breach. The wounded outnumbered the armed. The armed outnumbered the sane. I had treated men who believed their intestines whispered prophecies, men who tried to dig graves for corpses still breathing, men who begged to be chained so they wouldn't tear out their own eyes. Chaos does not simply kill. It corrodes identity. It erodes the boundaries between flesh and thought until a man becomes a question with no answer. I could not save them from that, not with bandages or morphia or prayer. At dawn, bombardment began from every direction at once. Shells rained down in waves that tore trenches open like cracked veins. Shockwaves hurled bodies across the mud, limbs twisting unnaturally mid-air. The sky reddened from chemical burn-off. I covered my ears, but nothing silenced the roar. Men clutched rosaries, recited the litany of endurance, or screamed until their throats tore. Seren anchored himself against a shattered cogitator core, his augmented limbs digging into the metal while he stabilized wounded soldiers with calm efficiency that bordered on inhuman. Darren fired into oncoming cultists, barrel glowing red-hot, eyes empty of anything resembling fear or hope. The world shrank to detonations and ragged breath. The first wave of casualties came so fast I could not triage. A plasma burst melted half a squad into fused glass and bone. I tried to identify individuals, but their faces had melted into a single, unrecognizable mass. My instinct was to turn away. My training forced me forward. I pressed sealant compound into flesh that no longer resembled flesh, and realized I was treating corpses that simply hadn't stopped twitching yet. The line between life and death had dissolved. A heartbeat was not a guarantee of survival. Absence of pulse was not the end. The battlefield had become a purgatory, where dying was a process, not an event. As artillery rolled on, enemy infantry surged through breaches in our perimeter. They descended the trench walls in a frenzy of blades, chains, spiked augmetics, and improvised weapons still dripping with gore. Their chants drowned out gunfire, words that burned the air like acid. A woman with flayed skin stapled across her armor leaped over the barricade, swinging a hooked scythe straight at me. I ducked, feeling the blade shear a lock of hair. Darren shot her twice in the chest. She staggered, grinning through shredded lungs, and impaled herself further onto the barrel to reach him. He stabbed her in the throat, both of them collapsing in a spray of blood. She died with laughter on her lips. I pulled Darren away, forcing him to drop his rifle so I could seal the wound across his forearm. He winced, but stayed silent. The gash bled heavily. I cauterized it with heated metal plating torn from debris. The smell of burnt flesh clung to us, thick enough to taste. Darren didn't wait for permission. He snatched up his gun and returned fire before the steam evaporated from his skin. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Fatigue blurred perception. When the bombardment ceased, silence hit harder than artillery. The air trembled with a tension so palpable it felt like the world held its breath. Then something larger than infantry moved across the field. Warp beasts emerged from fractured Manufactorum vaults, massive entities of bone and flame, their mouths splitting into vertical maws that emitted sounds too low to hear but violent enough to vibrate my ribs. Soldiers broke ranks at the sight, fleeing into the open where they were cut down by cultists. Commissars fired on deserters until their pistols clicked dry. No order could contain terror given physical form. I dragged a wounded woman behind a toppled hab wall, her abdomen torn open by shrapnel. Intestines spilled through her armor, steaming in the cold air. She sobbed, hands shaking as she tried to hold herself together. "Don't let me go," she whispered. I knelt, pressing organs gently back inside, sealing flesh with foam and patches. She gasped at every touch. When the bleeding stopped, her breath steadied. She reached up, fingers brushing my cheek. "Thank you," she murmured, and died before her hand fell. I lowered her gently, forehead to the dirt, and closed her eyes. My hands shook. I wiped blood on my coat and moved to the next body. As we fell back deeper into the ruins, the world darkened beneath an eclipse of smoke and warp light. Fires consumed assembly platforms. Melted metal rained from broken gantries. Shrieking wind funneled through tunnels, carrying voices that begged in languages no human tongue could form. The ground quaked. Reality wavered. Men fell through cracks that swallowed them up without sound. We regrouped near the central loader spire, a towering skeletal structure wrapped in chains of corrupted steel and sparking pneumatic tubing. Someone had attempted to convert it into a last defensive position. Heavy bolters mounted on shattered consoles fired blindly into advancing hordes. A squad of troopers huddled beside a burning wreck, eyes wide, rifles shaking. Their sergeant knelt against a pillar, throat slit, still gripping a data slate that displayed retreat coordinates no one had followed. I moved among them, binding wounds, replacing tourniquets soaked through with arterial blood. One soldier clutched a photo of a child so tightly the paper fused to his glove. Another whispered that he could feel insects crawling under his skin. I scanned him. There were no insects. He died from shock moments later. At some point, Serin staggered, his mechanical limbs flickering with blue sparks from overload. He collapsed to a knee, Vox systems glitching as Binharic code poured uncontrolled into the air. I grabbed his shoulders. "Stay here," I said, though neither of us believed he would. He clutched my wrist, his fingers trembling with something like fear. The glow in his augmetic eye dimmed, replaced by a pained flicker. He typed a message into the dirt with one shaking mechadendrite. "Don't forget me." I couldn't answer. I moved on. Then the final breach came. The enemy broke through from 3 directions, swarming over barricades like a tide of broken flesh. Bolters roared, bayonets clashed, chainswords screamed. I found myself trapped between 2 collapsing walls, surrounded by wounded screaming for help. They piled on top of me, hands grasping, begging, pleading for salvation I could not give. Their blood soaked into my clothing until I could not tell where they ended and I began. A shell landed close enough to lift me from the ground. I slammed into debris, vision blurring. When I stood, ears ringing, I saw that half the wounded had been reduced to mist. The living still called to me. A man missing both legs reached up, nails tearing grooves in the rock as he tried to drag himself closer. "Please," he gasped, "don't leave me here." I knelt, pressing my forehead to his. His blood soaked into my collar. "I won't leave you," I whispered. He smiled weakly. "Good," he said, and bled. Out in my arms before I could stop him, I held him until his body cooled. Around us, the regiment shattered. Pockets of soldiers retreated through breaches in the ruins, some firing backward, others simply running. The ground trembled as more warp beasts poured in. One towering abomination stomped through a wall, its flesh covered in screaming faces. It swung a claw the size of a speeder transport, crushing men beneath its weight. The shockwave sent me sprawling. I crawled, dragging my medkit behind me, lungs burning. Darren appeared suddenly, grabbing my arm and hauling me to my feet. His rifle was gone. A broken blade jutted from his shoulder. He bled freely and did not seem to notice. His voice cracked. "It's over. We have to go." I looked around at the bodies. If we left, no one would mark them. No one would know where they fell. No rites, no names, no remnants. "A body is not a life," I said aloud, though I wasn't speaking to him. "It's everything that led to it." He shook me harder. "You can't save them." I smiled, though it felt like my face might crack. "I know. But I could be there. I could bear witness. I could refuse to let them die alone." Darren stared at me. understanding dawning slowly. He stepped back, tears mixing with dirt and blood. He raised a hand in salute, not to me, but to what I chose. Then he turned and disappeared into the smoke. Seren dragged himself across shattered steel, sparks trailing behind him like dying stars. He reached my side, collapsing, limbs shuddering. He leaned against my shoulder, machinery whirring in stuttering rhythms. Whether he stayed by choice or because he could no longer move, I never learned. The sky cracked open overhead, warp light pouring through like floodwater. The beasts roared. The cultists screamed hymns. Artillery fell without rhythm. I knelt among the dying, hands slick with blood, and worked until my vision faded. Not to save lives, to ease deaths. Bodies cooled around me, flesh stiffened. The wind carried smoke and the faint scent of burned oil. A voice, someone's, maybe mine, whispered names into the dark. My world narrowed to breath, heartbeat, hands. The battlefield dimmed. The war moved on. We remained, not alive, not dead, just present. And for the first time since landing on this damned world, I felt something close to peace, not because I believed in victory, but because I finally understood my duty, not to save the living, to honor the fallen. A body is not a life, but it deserves to be remembered.